Glad you could join us on yet another edition of the Nation Leadership Forum. As always, this is a platform that creates an interface for public policy and private sector and the public as well to begin to shape our ideas on matters, policy and various sectors. And over the couple of weeks past, we have been delving into a raft of issues, and tonight we are focusing on the real estate market. The real estate sector was valued at 675 billion shillings in 2019, accounting for 6.9% of Kenya's economy. The sector is a key driver of employment, creating in the country and providing direct wage employment for an estimated 4,400 Kenyans in 2019. COVID-19 has, however, led to a slowdown in the real estate sector. Physical distancing requirements have disrupted the sector's typical labor-intensive work environment. Depressed revenues have adversely affected the sector's capital-intensive projects, and investors are now left grappling with delay in project delivery timelines. What is the outlook for the real estate sector in Kenya? How is the sector navigating the hurdles presented by the adverse effects of the COVID-19 pandemic? What do the new developments such as the Kenya Mortgage Refinance Company portend for financing of the sector? To delve into this and more, I am joined by Johnston Oltetia, the Chief Executive Officer at the Kenya Mortgage Refinance Company, popularly known as by the acronym KMRC, Sakina Hassanali, the head of research and marketing at Haas Consult, and finally Engineer Maurice Akech, who serves as the National Construction Authority Executive Director. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome on set. And I should mention at this point that by the public, you can be part of this conversation by tweeting at NTV Kenya at AmbokoJH. The hashtag is NMG Leadership Forum. And just to kick off the conversation, I want to start with Johnston. Many of us are just curious to understand, what is your view of the real estate market as we speak in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, Johnston?
Thank you. So the real estate market has been affected by the COVID-19 just like any other sector around the country. Now, when you look at the effects of the COVID-19, you realize that housing is actually at the center of fighting the pandemic, and that's why people are being told to stay at home, wash hands, maintain social distancing, and that means that housing is essentially right at the center of the fight of the pandemic. Now, the real estate sector has obviously, like any other sector, experiencing a number of challenges, and the key challenges, in fact, is the lack of long-term affordable financing, and that is why KMRC had to be created. So KMRC was essentially formed in response to the challenges facing the housing finance market in Kenya.
Johnston, before you delve further into the issue of financing, because that will be part of our conversation tonight, let me just cross over to Sakina. And really, Sakina, we have been reading your reports from time to time regarding the real estate market. And of course, by early this year, you are indicating that the market is already experiencing a cool-off. To what extent has COVID-19 accelerated this development?
So I think it's important to note, first of all, that real estate is actually quite insulated from short-term shock compared to any other industry. However, we did see that activity from March to June completely froze. And I think this is because it was quite an unprecedented event, and most people didn't know what parameters to use to make any buying or investment decision. However, when the economy opened up in June, we saw sales activity come up about 50%, which is encouraging. But I do think there's a longer-term effect, economic effect, especially since the World Bank has said that we are moving from an economic growth of a forecasted 6% to 1%. And so that's what's going to have a slightly longer-term effect.
Engineer Maurice, you sit on the regulatory side, and here when it comes to regulation, you focus more on construction and how various projects are adhering to strict guidelines. How has it been, especially in light of the COVID-19 situation for you?
Thank you. National Construction Authority is basically a regulator for the construction industry. So one of our key mandates is to oversee the construction industry and coordinate its development. So from where we sit, we have the visibility of all the projects' footprint across the country, more so even for the real estate. And from what we have observed, the trend, because we took upon ourselves to look at what we've had in the period of when COVID started. So we went back to the beginning of March up to the end of June, and compare this to the previous 2 years, 2019 and 2018, looking at those numbers, there is a clear indication that there was a reduction of those who are applying for project registration so that they're able to get a compliance certificate, which we issue for construction to commence, by about 35%. That's quite huge, because what's expected that the trend should always be increasing, but during the COVID period, we noted that the trend actually declined by about 35%. That's quite substantial in the sector, and that really affects so many things, because construction industries has linkages to so many other sectors of our economy.
Crossing over back to Johnston, the subject of financing is extremely critical in this conversation. And you were mentioning just before I intercepted you there about the Kenya Mortgage Refinance Company. Majority of Kenyans would not be able to understand exactly what this is. Just walk us through the entity itself and the mandate that it has.
Thank you. KMRC was essentially formed, like I mentioned earlier, in response to the challenges facing the housing finance market in Kenya. Now, you realize that one of the greatest challenges that the country has been facing is an availability of short-term, long-term, affordable financing. And that essentially affects ability for people to afford the kind of houses that they will desire. And this is precisely the reason why KMRC was formed. So it's actually part of the kind of intervention or reform for the financial market. Now, KMRC was established very recently. It's only a very new institution, very much greenfield. It only was incorporated in 2018, I think in April. And the role of KMRC, or the purpose of KMRC, is to provide long-term fixed-rate financing to primary mortgage lenders. The primary mortgage lenders are banks, SACCOs, microfinance institutions, or essentially institutions that ordinarily offer mortgages as part of their business. Now, so you realize it's it's pretty much a wholesale financial institution that provides or lends to other financial institutions. Now, the idea here is to provide interventions so that with fixed long-term funds, this increases affordability and accessibility of financing to the majority of Kenyans. When KMRC provides financing, it does that, one, with long tenors, and two, with concessional or lower interest rates than otherwise available currently in the market. Now, that essentially then is meant to increase significantly the growth of the mortgage market in Kenya, which has been, very low for the last number of years.
Okay. Right, crossing over to Sakina and really just circling back to the point that Johnson has just raised right now. Official data indicates that we have about just 26,000 mortgages in this country. To what extent, Sakina, has financing been a challenge for people who want to take up property in the real estate market?
I would say it's the single biggest bottleneck to the growth of the property market, to more inclusion in home ownership for most Kenyans. Interestingly enough, it's also one of the things that protected us during the COVID situation, because highly leveraged markets would see a bigger fall during an event like this than we did. And because we are largely a cash-based property buying economy, we were able to be insulated from that. At the same time, even though it did protect us from this, I think it is the single biggest stumbling block to a really healthy property sector, to really reaching those 500,000 units a year that the government wants us to reach. 26,000 mortgages is not even 1% of the total number of purchases. And you'll see worldwide about 90% of property purchases are mortgage-backed. So we are far, far away from any sort of even average across the globe.
And staying with you, Sakina, the real estate market is not really homogeneous. There are various segments here. We can be talking about the top tier, mid tier, and the bottom tier. Just paint for us a picture of how the landscape is looking like as we speak. Because as I mentioned earlier, at the start of this year and towards the end of last year, we already had an indication that the top tier of the market was in a bit of a slowdown. What about the other segments of the market, Sakina?
I would say actually, last year before COVID hit, we already had a bit of a liquidity crunch in 2019, which was a bit challenging. And that sort of slowed down every aspect of the market. But I would have to say that from what I've seen, COVID has actually hit the middle and lower income market much more than the high end of the market. And so we're seeing a real slowdown in smaller ticket prices, properties with smaller ticket prices than the larger ones. So interestingly enough, it's the middle market and lower income markets that are the hardest hit right now.
Right. And Engineer Maurice, 2 years ago or so, we were talking about the national construction policy. Just curious to know how far are we with this and what impact is it having on the real estate market?
The construction industry policy is actually a good thing, and we started it because there was need for having an integrated policy that will overarch all the other subsector policies into place and create a coordination framework that will ensure that we have a structured way in which we approach the industry in terms of development. So this policy started about 2 years ago. It was conceived, developed, taken to the stakeholder for engagement, but it has now reached a stage where it needs to go to the next step, where it can be adopted the next level. And then after adoption, of course, we're expecting to come up with what we call sessional paper, which of course will go to the next level after approval, which means after being adopted at that level, it will become a legal document which can now be used to be implemented for purposes of improving how things are done in the industry. But the most emphasis is on coordination, collaboration, and capacity building. And I also like the fact that we are discussing issues of financing. Even that particular aspect has also been captured in that particular draft. So we are looking forward to an opportunity where it will see the light of day, so that at least we can have a way in which we can call a roadmap in which we can follow to ensure that things are done in a harmonious manner.
Engineer Maurice, just very quickly before we take a break, housing by the Constitution is a devolved function. How are you coordinating between the two levels of government, that's the national and the devolved units, when it comes to this policy?
Very important. That's why actually I indicated the issue of coordination. Even at the time of drafting this policy and making it to reach where it is, there was a lot of engagement between the national and county governments, so that there is input from every other user. Remember, development control is a function of the county government. So there is need to be very high level coordination between national and the county government, so that things happen in a smooth and organized manner, in a way that quality is guaranteed and safety is also ensured. So there is that coordination at that level, and coordination has also been identified as a key policy driver within that document. Thank you.
Johnson, in the budget statement for the financial year 2020-21, which is the current financial year, the Treasury CS did indicate that the KMRC had been capitalized to the degree of about 2 billion shillings. Just give us a sense of how far this is in terms of your funding requirements and how this enables you to kickstart your operations.
That's exactly right. So we have a slightly over 2.2 billion shillings capital. So we went out capital raising. We have about 21 shareholders, and we have a mix of shareholders actually, ranging from government, to a number of financial institutions, which includes banks and SACCOs. Now, that kind of financing is essentially the core capital for the institution. We've also been able to mobilize additional capital, which is the kind of money that we need for refinancing, and that is to the tune of 35 billion shillings. This was raised in form of sovereign, from the World Bank and the African Development Bank, and that is, lent to the government, and the government lends to KMRC. So with that kind of financing, we have been preparing a pipeline of demand for purposes of lending that financing, and we've done a portfolio review and obviously found that there are portfolio out there for housing purposes that can be lent by KMRC. So that is essentially the first phase of our capital raising. For sustainability, however, KMRC will have to go to the capital markets and issue bonds for purposes of raising additional capital. And that obviously is the kind of capital that KMRC will be raising from time to time. For the time being, though, it will start with the concessional financing raised, potentially blend the financing at some stage with the capital market financing, and use that for purposes of lending for housing purposes.
Johnson, just to stay with you for a minute, when you talk about KMRC, we'll have to go to the capital markets and, of course, issue something like a debt facility by way of a bond. Aren't you worried, considering the kind of state in which our bond market is presently, where it's largely government? Corporates are not going there much because of understandable reasons. There was a bit of toxicity around a number of issuances. So does it bother you, or do you feel comfortable?
Well, you will look at it this way. The macroeconomic environment in the recent past has improved. So, when we had interest rate caps, it was essentially impossible for any corporate to go to the market to issue bonds. Now that interest rate cap was lifted. And the reason is, when you have caps which are very close to a government instrument like a treasury bond, then essentially becomes difficult, because pricing of a bond is on top of a risk-free instrument like a treasury bond. Now, the government has been putting in place mechanism to improve the macro environment, and that essentially enables any corporate to go to the market. At the moment, it's actually possible, but what we are looking at is KMRC will be going to the market maybe in a year or two. So we expect the macro environment to continue improving over time. There has been a little bit of a challenge, you're right, that the government has been crowding out private sector in the market, and that's why you see government frequently going to the market to issue treasury bonds and treasury bills, and that essentially crowds out the private sector. But when you look at in the recent past, in fact, yields for government securities have been going down, and that's actually good for a corporate, because the government securities are essentially the risk-free instrument on which you price up your bond. So when KMRC goes to the market to issue a bond, which we anticipate to do that next year, initially it will be a challenge for a corporate like KMRC, because it's a new institution and doesn't have a track record for that purpose. But we are essentially planning to replace our track record with some kind of credit enhancement by another institution. So we have a AAA rated institution like African Development Bank, who we already have some undertaking to support KMRC in its initial bond issuance. So in our view, I think we are ready essentially to go to the market, and we believe at some point KMRC will be an issue of record, issuing corporate bonds from time to time, and that kind of instrument is what will provide sustainability for KMRC.
Okay. I should clarify at this point that when Johnson talks about risk-free lending by the government, he essentially means that the government is not expected to default on the debt instruments that it does put out into the market. So therefore, corporates are now expected to price their debt slightly higher or significantly higher than that, depending on how investors consider the risk profile. The hashtag is NMG Leadership Forum. And on the panel, we have voices from KMRC, HasConsult, and the National Construction Authority. And to cross over to Sakina, before the break, you mentioned something extremely important about the liquidity crunch that the market was already experiencing. Many are just curious to know, we repealed the cap on lending rates in November 2019. To what degree has this been afforded the market a bit of a breather? Because this was definitely one of the key challenges being faced.
So I think it's been difficult to tell, because we knew that the interest rate cap was what was sort of giving us this liquidity store. And then we only had about 3 months before we had the COVID situation. So it's been a bit difficult to tell. I know that between March and May, when the economy the economy basically went into a bit of a stall, and that wasn't because of the interest rates or the financial system. It was because everyone sort of paused on any decisions that they were making, whether it came to business investments or expansion or or property purchases. And so there was no liquidity in the market at that time, because no one wanted to spend. I do know that bank deposits during that time were seen to be going quite high. So unfortunately, we've been unable to tell the difference that the interest rate cap lifting has had on liquidity, just because we've been faced with the new situation. I do know that in June, when the economy or timings will regularize a bit more, that we did see activity come back, up 50% from what it was in the stall of March to May. And so that was very encouraging. But we are still seeing that the middle to lower end market has been a little less, has rebounded a little less than the high end market.
All right, Engineer Maurice, enforcement has been a key challenge when it comes to your mandate, but there have been a number of changes in the recent past which should facilitate your ability to actually ensure that this takes place. Just give us an update as far as enforcement is concerned.
Yeah, thank you very much. In fact, previously, of course, our mandate is also to undertake quality assurance and ensure that the projects that are being undertaken or construction that are going on are done in a quality manner and follow all the required statutory requirements and follow the law. But before March of this year, we were having no teeth to bite, if I may call it so, because our Act, of course, envisages that when there's something that's not compliant, we issue a suspension to the construction site or to the developer undertaking the construction. And we can issue this many times, that was previously, but around March, under the Business Amendment Act, we got an amendment there that gives us a very good opportunity to take action for especially those who continuously do not comply with our suspension notices when they do not follow due process or they do not follow the law. So now the law has been amended, and there's a provision where if any person is issued with a suspension notice due to an non-compliance and they fail to comply, one, we can take legal action against them through the legal process, and if they're found culpable, either they can be jailed for a term of not more than 3 years, or can be fined for a fine of not more than $1 million, or both, depending on what the judge may determine as the case may be. So this is a very good opportunity. The other issue that was also included is the fact that now inspections have been made to be mandatory by law. Previously, of course, either the developer may decide that they continue without having to look for us to do the inspection, or even as we are also compelled as NCA and to also carry out the mandatory inspections. So this gives us an opportunity that now there is no escape route. So in a way, it's going to enhance compliance, it's also going to enhance quality, and going forward, we expect that the enforcement now will be much stronger and even more solid as we move forward. So this is a very good opportunity for us as an authority and as a country. Thank you. And
staying with you, Engineer Akech, I'm just curious to know, to what degree has COVID-19 changed the manner in which you inspect this project sites, especially in light of things like social distancing that are required now in view of the circumstances?
Good question. Actually, there are two ways there. There is the point where our officers go onto the ground to carry out quality assurance checks or inspections. This has been affected by the way that now, in terms of maintaining the social distancing, one, we have to continue using the same resources we have, but now our officers have to be very minimal in that operating tool, call it a vehicle. And now it means they cannot be able to visit as many sites as they would be able to visit before, when they used to go in a group and then spread out. So in that regard, the number of sites being visited has reduced. But also on the other side of development, the developers also, a number of sites have stalled. Some of them have slowed down. Some of them have actually suspended on a mutual agreement between the developer and the contractor so that they are not going on. So there's reduced workload out there. At the same time, there's also reduced activity because of the numbers. We have to keep as few as possible to go to site. But I also want to say that there are areas where other sectors of the construction, maybe outside the real estate sector, especially on the road and projects that have to be done in an open space, they are able to maintain social distancing. That's the construction workers. And this way, with the guidelines that we've also issued around April, they're also able to follow that and they're able to do very well. So as we speak today, maybe I can confirm that we've not had a direct, direct construction industry worker who has been affected. They may be out there, but to our, within our records, we have not received any reports of any construction worker who has been affected, because whenever we go to sites, we keep asking, but so far we've not received any information. So to that regard, I think we are still good. Thank you.
All right. Crossing over to Johnston, when you talk about long-term financing through the KMRC, of course, appreciating that KMRC will not be extending mortgages direct to the end beneficiaries, but to financial institutions. How long-term is long-term from the KMRC definition?
So we are talking about, 20, 25-year money. When you look at the situation in our market in the recent past, you realize that while banks have liquidity, the kind of liquidity they have is short-term. And the liquidity we are actually talking about is deposits. And they tend to invest that for long-term investments like housing. And what that means is that it results in some mismatch between their assets and liability. A lot of times regulators have some caps in relation to how much you can mismatch your book. And that's why now KMRC is coming in to remove that maturity mismatch. Now, the long-term financing that will be provided by KMRC is 20, 25-year money. So with, the greatest thing that affects affordability is actually the tenor of a loan. It's far less of an interest rate. It's mainly the tenor. So if you extend a loan for 15, 20, 25 years, as opposed to taking a 10-year loan, there is a greater affordability issue there. The longer the money, the more affordable it is, and the more you have a lot more people who can qualify to get to access that kind of loan. So KMRC is certainly coming in to provide that kind of value proposition.
All right, and I should mention there that when Johnston talks about assets and liabilities, it's to appreciate that when you take your money to a bank, it is booked as liability because it is your deposit inside the bank. And when the bank extends a loan to you, then it becomes an asset to the bank because eventually you'll be repaying, and of course with the interest. But to stay with you, Johnston, just briefly, do you have a sense of to what degree this is likely to nudge downwards the interest rates that we normally face by way of mortgages when you expand these tenors?
Yeah, so you see, it's KMRC addressing two issues actually simultaneously. So it's addressing the tenor issue and addressing the interest rate issue at the same time. Now, when KMRC financing is mobilized, which we have finalized, when we extend that kind of financing for 20, 25 years, you also give it as concessional rates because the financing we are raising is also concessional. So we are actually giving at far better terms than are currently available in the market. We are talking about single digits. Most of the financing that is currently available is above 10%, and KMRC is providing financing at actually almost half of that. And the expectation is that that financing will also go into the ultimate borrower at single digits. So we would certainly encourage the institutions that are participating with KMRC to take up the KMRC financing and offer that financing at single digits. So when you combine the lower rates together with the longer tenor, then what it means is that you actually enable a lot more people to have access to home loans. And that's exactly what we want for purposes of influencing the growth of home loans in Kenya.
Sakina, to come to you, KMRC is not the only intervention the government has put forth. If you followed through the the Tax Laws Amendment Act of 2020. One of the amendments has provided that pensioners can access 40% of their accrued benefits to be able to purchase a home. To what extent do you see this as a game changer in the real estate sector, especially in terms of unlocking demand, Sakina?
I mean, certainly I have actually seen some of that activity come through. I think that will certainly help. A lot of it's interesting to know that at the moment, the majority of the people who invest, or the majority of people who buy houses, from what we've seen, 80% of them are investors, and about 20% of those are who actually want to buy homes. So I do think that would help, but I do think we need some time to see the effect of that. I'll give you an example. There's sometimes a lot of, so for example, in terms of diaspora money that has been coming, that has been a subject of conversation for a long time, in terms of how much the diaspora remittances are into the country. When you actually look at the percentage in terms of actual purchasing in the market, it's not a lot, even though the numbers do look rather large. So it would be interesting to sort of track that movement with pension funds releasing that, to see if it actually does make a dent in the industry.
Engineer Maurice, just to get your thoughts on the same issue. Of course, you're a key player in the construction sector. Now there's this provision that if I'm a pensioner, I can access up to 40% of my accrued benefits to purchase a home. How do you think this will impact the sector, Engineer Maurice?
Oh, from where we sit, I think it's a very good thing, because it will give an opportunity for someone to be a homeowner through the proceeds of their pension, because they'll be able to access a larger chunk of it at an earlier time, and that will increase the appetite, because the challenge sometimes out there in the real estate market is to get the capital for the down payment, the deposit that you need for you to now secure a mortgage. And I believe this is where the conversation also needs to be focused, because with that kind of money into the hands of the pensioner, there will be an opportunity for them to be able to access houses. And I think, given that even now the government is rolling out the affordable housing at very reasonable prices, it will be a good opportunity for people to be able to, Kenyans to be able to access decent houses that they can live in through that particular facility. So it's a good thing, and it's going to increase the uptake of houses in Kenya.
Johnston, to come to you back to you rather, and when I look at the banks and in terms of their asset quality, one of the key challenges banks will tell you is that a big chunk of their non-performing loans, or loans which are not being serviced as required, fall within the real estate sector. To what extent do you feel this is hampering your efforts, even as you start? Because, of course, there's already this perception from the lenders to whom you should be pouring in this capital that already there's a significant amount of risk out there in the market.
That's exactly right. And the reason why you have that kind of challenge is because institutions extend financing, especially for home, which is long-term, with floating rates. So you see floating rates or floating interest rates happens that whenever markets shift, then of course the prices shift and potentially, and in most cases actually increase, then that rate increases. When that rate increases and your income has not increased in tandem, what will happen is that you will not then be able to afford to pay for that house anymore. And that's what increases the non-performing loans. Now, you have in this market a lot of that has happened. And then the other thing is the property prices, which keep changing from time to time. There has been this perception or assumption that property prices will always increase. And what that means is that should the market shift and the properties start declining, like I think that is one of the results of the COVID-19 pandemic, then you start experiencing challenges, because the homeowners will not be able to leverage, to obtain more resources using their property values. Now, going back to the issue of non-performing loans, it's true that is, but when you look at the contribution of the non-performing loans to the overall non-performing loan books, it's it continues to rise. Now, what KMRC is going to do is to provide fixed long-term financing. Now, that has not been the case in our market. Most, I think 80 to 90% of financing in this market is on floating rate basis. When you provide long-term, that means that a borrower will obviously see the end from the beginning. You'll then obviously, manage to mirror your financing accordingly. Should your circumstances change in between, then of course you'll have a little more available resources for other purposes. But when you link up that and then you remove the risk, the credit risk that comes with floating rate, then you'll potentially address some of the challenges of non-performing loans, because there is very clear visibility from the borrower of the kind of income that you have, and which you'll certainly be aware when you finally pay the loan, nothing will have changed in between.
All right, and coming to Sakina, one of the things which Engineer Ketch mentioned just in his comments before Johnson took over is the aspect of the affordable housing agenda. And this is something which has been quite a matter of interest out here, because the government is targeting about 500,000 housing units by 2022. Just give us a sense of how this is impacting the real estate sector, or is likely to impact, because of course the rollout has been a bit delayed because of one reason or the other.
Personally, I think that it's difficult for any government to be able to personally supply 500,000 houses themselves. It should be the work of the private sector, and the only way to do that is to remove the bottlenecks that actually prevent provision of large-scale housing. And one of the biggest ones is financing. And so, if you were able to get us to rates of between 5 and 7%, I believe developers would be able to, in terms of also developers borrowing as well as people buying at that rate, I think that the market would automatically react and be able to supply that kind of housing. So I find it a little bit unrealistic for them to be able to achieve that by providing it themselves, by providing free land. So I do think that instead of treating the symptoms, you do have to treat the disease. And that is, what are the bottlenecks that are stopping the provision of affordable housing? And if we are able to address that, I do think we'll be able to provide more than 500,000 houses a year. And the private sector could do it quite easily if the motivation is there.
But Sakina, to be fair to the government, I think the idea is that it should crowd in private investors to play that role. Actually, the government is supposed to play a facilitative role by way of the surrounding environment. So don't you think when they delve into issues like the land valuation index, they are on a step in the right direction in terms of addressing some of the systemic challenges you're pointing out?
So I think, to be honest, I think there are a few big bottlenecks, and those take on about 80% of the problem. And then there are some other smaller bottlenecks that won't really solve the issue. So if you take care of financing and infrastructure, that's the two things I think that developers face an issue with. Financing we've talked about. Infrastructure is about providing everything, all the services that service the land, that allow a developer to be able to build without adding that much cost and services, as well as providing roads, which to be fair to them, they have done, providing roads that make areas that are further away seem closer. I think a big I would say Kiambu, the amount of road infrastructure that has gone into Kiambu Road, into the Kiambu County, the Thika Road highway has been a big success story. You can see it by looking at the values of the property there, looking at the land values, looking at the amount of stock of property that's increased in that area, simply from just improving the infrastructure in the area. If they're able to do this, the housing will actually come up on its own. So I do think there are some big ticket items that need to be taken care of.
All right, and that point by Sakina takes us to our second break on this discussion on real estate, the market outlook in light of COVID-19. Don't change the channel, because we'll be right back with a lot more on this conversation. Break, we were discussing issues regarding the affordable housing agenda, and Sakina Assanali of House Consult had given us a bit of thoughts around it. Engineer Akech, we're just wondering, what role does the NCA play within this affordable housing agenda?
Very good. Now, affordable housing agenda, first of all, involves construction of houses at affordable prices and spearheaded and facilitated by the government. So our role as National Construction Authority, one, is to ensure that the contractors working on those projects are registered and professionally so. Two, is to also ensure that the artisans they are working with are also accredited by National Construction Authority and site supervisors as well. Three is to ensure that those projects have been also registered by us and they have compliance certificates. And above all, we continue engaging them during construction works, just like we do in other projects, to ensure that there's quality assurance and they comply with all the requirements. So basically, we have a big role that ensures that at the end of the day, the quality is assured. So the projects, once delivered, we can say that they're safe and sound and good to occupy. So in that regard, we play our regulatory role and ensure that all aspects of our mandate is taken on board as the projects continue to be done in our country.
So quality assurance is the key pillar there. And crossing over to Johnston, when we began this whole conversation about affordable housing, one of the key instruments that we saw in the housing regulations at the time was the provision for a statutory deduction of 1.5% of income towards the housing fund. Of course, this has been derailed by a court order. Curious to know how this, if any way, has affected the KMRC, because, of course, the government was hoping to be able to raise capital through this means. Now, clearly, that has been thrown into another arrangement.
So the 1.5% deduction that was envisaged was actually meant to go to the National Housing Development Fund. KMRC has no relations whatsoever with that kind of deduction. KMRC has means and ways of mobilizing financing, and it's actually been doing that on its own. And so the effect of the deduction or the non-deduction of the 1.5% has absolutely no relations with KMRC. But obviously, KMRC is obviously keen to see that there is supply of houses in the market. So we continue to work with the Department of Housing and the developers and the rest to ensure that there is clear visibility of the supply, because otherwise when you build financing on this other side of demand and you don't have clear visibility of the supply, then certainly you will not be able to match the two. So we are following very keenly to see that the people who are involved in the supply side are doing their part as we obviously align with the demand side that we have been building at the KMRC.
All right, many thanks, Johnston. Sakina, one of the areas which has attracted a lot of investor appetite in the recent past has been student accommodation. And of course, there are many questions coming online regarding what this segment of the market looks like, especially in light of the challenges we are now facing. We are not so sure what the future of schools, especially higher learning institutions, will look like. What's your assessment going forward?
So the problem with student housing is, if you look at it, the case of how housing has been provided in this country, it's mainly that, okay, so if I were to go back, initially 20 odd years ago, financing rates were very high. And so what developers decided to do is sell units on an off-plan basis, so the buyer would actually fund construction and therefore they would bypass the whole debt requirement of a project. So because of that, we've had this huge construction boom because of off-plan housing, and that's what's given us our rental supply to some extent. The reason it's not happening in housing, and even though it's a huge need, is that it requires a lot of capital because it is built for rental. And if you were to build it to sell to an investor to rent it out, you would need a big ticket investor, because you're not looking at selling a few apartments, you're looking at selling an entire building. When you look at selling student housing piecemeal, there's a big management problem, because managing that kind of facility is very different from managing, for example, your own apartment. So there is a big disconnect when it comes to the provision of student housing, because the off-plan selling method doesn't really work for student housing. What we therefore really need is investors who are largely interested in rental returns and have the capital to be able to support that. And I do think the returns from that are actually will be quite superior given the complete lack of supply of student housing.
And talking about the rental returns that we'll be looking at from this kind of investment or an asset class, if I could call it, generally we are under the impression, we could be wrong or right, that rental yields have been coming down. Sakina, what's your view of how this has been evolving in the market, depending on which segment of the market you're looking at?
So what I'll say is traditionally on a residential property, your yield is about 3 to 4%. What HAS does is try to create properties that will get between 7 to 8%, mainly because we look at high demand, low supply areas. But when it comes to student housing, I think you could hit between 12 to 15% quite easily. Again, there's a huge capital requirement, which is the only really bottleneck in this supply chain.
And crossing over to Engineer Akech, there's a gentleman asking on Twitter if they have a development project that they're looking at developing, of course, what are the basic elements that they should have for them to have a green light from your authority?
Any developer planning to put up a development in terms of a house or any other item or in terms of infrastructure, for housing, one of the key things that they need to know, one, is that they need to involve professionals and discuss with them so that they come up with a design. And we expect at the end of that design, they've agreed with the designer. Most of the time, the first person is the architect, the first professional, before they go to the structural engineer, before they go to the cost, which is the quantity surveyor. We will expect that particular plans to be submitted to the county for which where the development will take place for county to approve. So one of the things we'll be looking at National Construction Authority, which will come at the tail end, is the approved drawing from the county where the development is taking place. The other thing that we look for is we expect that particular development to affect the environment. So there is need, depending on the threshold of that particular development, to get environmental approval from the relevant authority, in this particular case, NEMA, where that particular information or license is also submitted at the time of application. The other thing, depending on where the development is taking place, if it's near a water body, they'll require a water resources authority approval. If it's happening near maybe an airport, require Kenya Civil Aviation Authority. Or if it is requiring, something to affect the road, then they'll also look out for the road authority. So there are many other areas to consider depending on where the project is taking place. Now, the application for registration of project at National Construction Authority basically is online, and we've also been able to leverage on continuity during the COVID because all our services are online. So once they apply and put all those documents that I've talked about, our team will carry out due diligence for those particular documents and where the project location is supposed to take place. And after they have carried the due diligence, they'll do the evaluation. And if everything is okay, then it will get approved and they'll get a compliance certificate. This particular process is free of charge. So the developer will not be charged anything, but I know on the other stages, depending on who they engage, they will be charged a professional fee and so on and so forth. So there is also, they can visit our website. Now they tweeted, I know they're also technology savvy, to check on additional information, which are actually well laid out in the National Construction Authority website.
All right, and Johnson, there are a number of questions which I will sum them up in suggesting that many are curious to know which institutions you're working with, especially when it comes to the financial institutions. There is an impression out here, based on what I'm seeing here online, that you're working predominantly with banks. I know that's not the case, but for their comfort, please just explain which institutions, financial institutions you're working with for this long-term financing.
So we are working with 3 categories of institutions. We have banks, we have SACCOs, and we have microfinance banks. We actually have 8 commercial banks. We have 11 SACCOs that are working with us. When you look at the kind of banks we're working at, we have the kind of KCB, Cooperative Bank, Housing Finance, Stanbic Bank, Barclays, Credit Bank, ABSA, that was certainly Barclays, NCBA, and even DTB. Now, we have a number of SACCOs that are participating with us. There are actually 11 of them. We have Mwalimu National SACCO, we have Stima SACCO, we have Imarika SACCO, we have Tower SACCO. We have quite a number of them. So the issue here is that we are working with that mix of institutions, because the reason why we brought in SACCOs to the KMRC model is essentially because we understand that SACCOs provide affordable housing. They do incremental housing developments. They give out personal loans, which a majority of which goes into housing, and that's why exactly we have SACCOs. We also have Kenya Women Microfinance Bank, which obviously does micro loans and tends to lend to women and a number of other institutions. So KMRC is working with that wide range of institutions for purposes of obviously influencing the growth of housing wide across. The kind of focus that KMRC has is to try as much as possible to drive financing down market. At the moment, it's focusing on the higher end of the market, and we really want to go down market, and that's why we are working with microfinance institutions and SACCOs.
And crossing over to Sakina, there are a number of questions regarding the many auctions we saw in the past, and we continue still to see regarding the property market. What does this mean for the market, and what is your outlook like? So many are just curious to know what you make in terms of your medium to long-term outlook for the real estate market in Kenya.
Okay, so it's important to note that we're not in a very leveraged market, right? So that means the people who bought their houses paid all the money that they needed for that house, right? So if they come upon some economic distress, it's unlikely that they are going to highly discount that property and put it onto the market. And so on average, you're seeing that's what's happening. However, in some cases, you are going to have what's called distress sales. And this is in the case where somebody's business perhaps has been hit by the situation, and they're in urgent need of cash flow, in which they would go into extreme discounting. So even though we are seeing these hotspots of auction properties or foreclosures or highly discounted properties, it's a very small percentage of the market. Majority of the market is just sort of holding for this, what they believe a short-term situation to pass.
Right, I should clarify that when Sakina talks about the fact that we are not in an extremely leveraged market, she means that not many have tapped into credit facilities to be able to purchase the properties that they are in or they are owning at this point. Engineer Akech, there's a question here from a gentleman here in the public who is asking that if I'm living in a building and I come back and find it has been marked the X with the NCA, what do I do next?
Well, that could mean many things. When we go out for quality assurance checks or inspections, we look out for 7 things, and this is mostly on sites that are still under construction, where one of the things we check out is whether the contractor on site is licensed by National Construction Authority. We also check whether the project is registered by National Construction Authority. We also check whether we have qualified professionals. Do you have an architect on that project? Do you have an engineer on that project? Do you have a quantity surveyor on that project? And these are the people that we expect that at the time of registration, you had already included their name, so we have them in our database. So the other thing we look out for is the issue around the safety, maybe in 2 ways. One is the site properly hoarded to act as a barrier for the passerbys, the third parties, or for the guys outside, not inside, not just to get out there, or do the workers on that site properly equipped in terms of personal protective equipment? The word PPE has now become very common. The one that has now been added is the one for COVID. So are they properly protected using those PPEs? And we also check whether there's a site signboard. And then if we also check other things like, for instance, we want to know whether the engineers have visited the site or architects have visited the site by looking at the site records. So if we find anything out of those 7 items is missing, then it will inform that we need to issue a notice of suspension until you comply. So when somebody comes back and finds an X in their building, it means either they are living in a building that is still under construction, and then maybe they have occupied the parts that are already completed. It means, again, it's not safe for them. So in a way, they need to seek audience with us, and we'll advise them on what are the issues, because I believe that particular person may be either the user or a consumer, but maybe the developer is the one that is actually given that suspension notice as a responsible person to comply with the requirements.
Right, and Johnson, just before we get into our closing remarks, there's a question here for you that the CEO of KMRC talks about 2 billion shillings in capital and a number of financial institutions they're working with. Have they already begun extending this finance to this institution such that we can begin benefiting as end borrowers, Johnston?
So we are starting to do that shortly. So actually, we anticipate to start lending within this quarter. So stay on, because we are ready. We have been, trying to do a portfolio review exercise. The portfolio review is because KMRC lends, secured money, so providing money against a portfolio of mortgages. And for that purpose, we have been undertaking that portfolio review for purposes of determining the kind of portfolio that will be available that meets eligibility criteria for KMRC for purposes of lending to that institution. So we will be coming in, extending that financing very, very shortly, potentially within this quarter. And what we advise Wananchi is that you need to start either approaching your SACCO who is participating with KMRC or your bank, and you'll be able to get the kind of home loans that you desire, which will essentially be affordable.
Right, and just briefly before we get into the closing remarks, Johnson, how robust is this pipeline? I'm just curious to know regarding, when you talk about the portfolio, of course, the pipeline that you're looking at, what's your assessment of it?
Recently, we did a portfolio review actually earlier in the year, and we found out a pipeline of about 50 billion Kenya shillings that is lendable. The issue is that we are focusing on providing financing essentially for purposes of the middle, low income people. So we are talking about, eligibility of a mortgage of about 4 million in Nairobi and Nairobi metropolitan area, and about 3 million elsewhere. And we are also focusing on an income threshold of about 150,000 Kenya shillings per month. And when we did a portfolio review, we determined there is actually that kind of portfolio that's available for KMRC refinancing. But essentially, when you look at that, you note that KMRC is lending against existing portfolio for now. But going forward, that will be the initial start. But going forward, KMRC will lend against new portfolio. That means we would be encouraging people to, go out there and look for the appropriate houses and get the banks to lend, and then KMRC will refinance that kind of portfolio. Lending against existing portfolio certainly will not make the greatest impact, okay. But the greatest impact that KMRC will create is when, banks start originating new portfolio, yes, and providing, access for that kind of portfolio that we need.
All right, we have about 3 minutes to go, and I'd just like us to get into our wrapping up remarks to quickly start with Sakina. What are your closing thoughts in light of this conversation you've had, Sakina?
I think in as much as it's been a struggle in the real estate market, I do think there's always a silver lining. And I think one of the things that we're going to learn from this is how to get really efficient. When you look at the construction rates of Kenya versus some of the developed countries, they're actually the same, even though we have access to cheaper labor and materials. So I do think there's a lot of efficiency to be learned from the situation. And I think by the end of it, we'll be getting there. So even though we're going through a tough period right now, I do think we'll be a more effective sector after that.
Engineer Ketch, your closing thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. I think given that COVID has brought challenging business environment, as National Construction Authority, of course, we are alive to that fact. And there are a few things we are put in place to ensure that we mitigate the effects of this COVID, especially to the construction sector players. One of it is that the fees for the penalty fees. Normally there's a penalty for those who have not renewed their license, that's the contractors. So that has been waived for the SME contractors. That is in the category of 6, 7, and 8. Again, there's also normally a mandatory training requirement for the license to be renewed. Again, this was waived because of the circumstances that were prevailing. And most importantly also, because when COVID came, there were guidelines issued by the Ministry of Health. But again, we had to sit as an industry, borrowing from those particular guidelines, to develop what we call standard operating procedures to ensure safety of construction workers and site supervisors and the contractors as they work on live construction sites. So that's a document that is also available on our website and can be referred upon, and is very important for purposes of ensuring that nobody contracts COVID-19 while they are working on sites. I think this has been a good opportunity, and I believe the audience has been well engaged. And for any questions, we are available on Twitter, social media, and on even our emails. Thank you.
Many thanks. Johnston, your closing thoughts?
So, under the current circumstances, the relations between health and housing has never been more acute. So the COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us of the need to have decent and affordable housing, with running water, with good sanitation, and with adequate space. So, so this is a real time to shift to affordable housing. So the need for affordable housing at scale is needed now more than ever before. So we should be focusing on going into developing those housing at scale. There potentially will be motivation for people now to shift into better housing post COVID-19. And this is obviously drawing from lessons learned from the rigidities and the restrictions that have been given in the recent past following the emergence of the COVID-19. Now, when people had that motivation and potentially start shifting and upgrading into better housing, then certainly there will be, a new requirement for affordable housing, so that people can shift into those houses to build resilience, in case of future pandemics.
All right. And that point by Johnston takes us to the close of our discussion on Nation Leadership Forum tonight. We have been focusing on real estate, the market outlook in light of COVID-19. Many thanks to the Chief Executive Officer of the Kenya Mortgage Refinance Company, Sakina Asanali from Haas Consult, as well as Maurice Akech, Engineer Maurice Akech, I should say, from the National Construction Authority. And thanks to the viewers for your feedback, which has been quite instructive in light of our conversation. And Flora Atieno, who has been my co-pilot on the sign language. We'll be back with a lot more on this subject on our online platform. So stay tuned, and the news is up next shortly.